The house smelled like money and marble. That's the first thing you noticed when you walked through the doors of the Castellano estate. Not warmth, not home, just the cold perfection of surfaces that had never been touched by anything honest. Isabella Castellano was 17 the summer. Everything changed. Not 17 like other girls, not worried about prom dresses or college applications. 17 like a knife, learning it has an edge. She moved through rooms the way her father moved through the city. Silent, observing, calculating the cost of everything before deciding if it was worth keeping. Her father, Vincent Castellano, controlled the waterfront. That's what people said when they thought she wasn't listening. He controlled things. Shipping routes, labor unions, the mayor's schedule. He controlled things the way gravity controls falling, inevitably and visibly, without ever raising his voice. The estate sat on 12 acres in Westchester, behind gates that opened like a mouth swallowing secrets. Inside, everything gleamed. Crystal chandeliers caught afternoon light and turned it into something cold. Marble floors reflected footsteps, but never memories. It was the kind of house that looked perfect in magazines and felt empty at 3 in the morning when you couldn't sleep because of what you'd overheard at dinner. Isabella had learned early that beautiful things were often the most dangerous. Her mother's smile, for instance. Porcelain and practiced, it never quite reached her eyes anymore. Catherine Castellano wore Chanel the way other women wore armor, and she moved through charity galas with the precision of someone who'd forgotten how to feel anything that wasn't scheduled. "Darling, sit up straight," her mother would say, voice like champagne poured over ice. People are watching. People were always watching. That's why nobody noticed Grace at first. Grace Williams arrived on a Tuesday in June, carrying a single suitcase and wearing a dress that had seen better decades. She was 42, but looked older in the way that hard work ages you. Not with wrinkles, but with a kind of careful stillness, like she'd learned to take up less space than she deserved. Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, introduced her during the morning briefing that Isabella wasn't supposed to hear. "This is Grace. She'll be taking over the 3rd floor. Mr. Castellano wants everything perfect for the foundation gala next month." Grace nodded once, said nothing. Her hands were still at her sides. Workers' hands, Isabella noticed. Not like her mother's, which had never scrubbed anything harder than her own reputation. Isabella watched from the landing, hidden behind the curve of the staircase. She'd perfected the art of invisibility in her own home. Her father had taught her that, accidentally, the way predators teach prey to freeze. Grace looked up, just once. Their eyes met for half a second. Something passed between them that Isabella couldn't name yet. Not friendship, not recognition, just a flicker of understanding that they were both ghosts in this house, haunting different floors. The days began to blur together the way summer days do when you're young and trapped. Isabella spent mornings in the library pretending to read French literature while actually watching the household move beneath her. She'd learned early that power wasn't in speaking. It was in noticing what others thought you'd miss. She noticed that Grace arrived at 6 every morning, before the sun turned the marble floors gold. She noticed that Grace ate lunch alone in the kitchen, never in the staff dining room. She noticed that Grace hummed sometimes when she thought no one was listening. Old hymns, the kind Isabella's grandmother used to sing before she died, and took all the warmth out of this house with her. And she noticed that her father never looked at Grace directly, the way he never looked at anything he considered beneath his concern. That should have been the first warning. The house had rules, unspoken but absolute. The help stayed downstairs unless summoned. Family stayed upstairs unless entertaining. No one asked questions about her father's business. No one mentioned Uncle Tony, who disappeared 3 years ago after saying the wrong thing at the wrong dinner. No one acknowledged that the beautiful life they lived was built on bones. Isabella had broken exactly one rule in her 17 years. She'd asked her father what he did for a living. She was 12. He'd looked at her for a long moment, then smiled, the smile that made prosecutors retire early and witnesses forget their own names. "I provide opportunities, Piccola. I help people get what they want. And if they don't want to pay?" The smile widened. "Everyone pays eventually. The only question is whether they choose the currency." She never asked again, but she kept watching. It was a Thursday when Isabella first spoke to Grace. The air conditioning had broken in her wing, some failure in the system that Mrs. Chen blamed on the heat, though Isabella suspected it was just the house showing its age beneath all that polish. Grace was cleaning the hallway windows, moving with the kind of efficiency that came from years of being invisible. She didn't jump when Isabella appeared, didn't smile, just nodded once, the way she'd nod at a mirror. "You're new," Isabella said, not a question. "Yes, miss. Don't call me that." Grace's hands paused on the window frame. "What should I call you?" "Isabella." She said it like a challenge, like she was testing whether this woman would treat her like a person or a title. Grace considered this. Then, carefully, Isabella. It was the first time anyone in this house had said her name, like it belonged to a human being instead of a dynasty. "You don't have to clean my room," Isabella said. "I can do it myself." "That's not how this works." "How what works?" "This." Grace gestured at the house, at the marble and crystal, and carefully maintained illusion of perfection. "Your world." "It's not my world, it's my father's." "Same thing, isn't it?" Isabella wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she hadn't chosen this life, these gates, this beautiful prison. But Grace had already turned back to the windows, and something in her posture said the conversation was over. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. She lay in her four-poster bed, the kind of bed that cost more than most people earned in a year, and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe, the old wood settling, the air conditioning humming, her mother's pills rattling in the bathroom down the hall. Somewhere below, her father was in his study. She could picture him, sitting in the leather chair that had belonged to his father, drinking scotch that cost more than Grace's monthly salary, making phone calls that would ruin lives before breakfast. She thought about Grace's hands, steady, certain, nothing like her mother's, which shook sometimes when she thought no one was looking. By dawn, something had shifted, not broken, not yet, just cracked, like ice at the end of winter, still solid but no longer trustworthy. Isabella didn't know it yet, but she'd just made her first real choice. Not the choice to speak to Grace. That was accident, opportunity. The choice was simpler, more dangerous. She'd decided to see her. And in her father's world, seeing people who were supposed to stay invisible was the beginning of every ending he'd ever orchestrated. The morning sun caught the windows Grace had cleaned, turning them into mirrors. Isabella stood at her bedroom door, looking at her own reflection fractured across expensive glass. She thought she was in control. That's the first mistake every storm makes before it breaks. AC2, the cracks, 12 and 24 soar. July arrived like an accusation, hot, relentless, pressing down on the estate until even the air felt expensive. The kind of heat that made you want to shed your skin along with your clothes to become something simpler than what you were born to be. Isabella started finding excuses to be where Grace was working, not obvious excuses. She'd learned subtlety from her father. She'd appear in the library when Grace was dusting the shelves, pretending to search for a book she'd already read twice. She'd linger in the hallway when Grace was changing linens, phone in hand like she was texting friends she didn't really have. Grace never acknowledged the pattern, just kept working with that same steady efficiency, moving through rooms like water around stones. But Isabella noticed things. The way Grace's jaw tightened when her mother swept past without a word of greeting. The careful distance Grace maintained from Mr. Castellano's study. As if violence had a smell, and she'd learned to avoid it. The small silver cross she wore on a chain under her uniform, revealed only when she bent to pick something up, catching light, like a secret. It took 2 weeks before they spoke again. Isabella found Grace in the East Wing solarium, watering plants that her mother had ordered but never looked at. Orchids mostly, expensive and temperamental, like everything else Catherine Castellano collected. "My mother doesn't even know their names," Isabella said from the doorway. Grace didn't turn. "Don't need to know something's name to want it." "Is that how it works?" "That's how your mother works." Grace moved to the next orchid, testing the soil with her fingertips. She doesn't want beauty. She wants proof she can afford beauty. Isabella stepped into the solarium. The glass ceiling turned the heat into something physical, almost liquid. "You don't like her?" "I don't think about her enough to like or dislike her." "That's worse, isn't it? Being beneath notice?" Grace finally looked at her, really looked. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, with crow's feet at the corners that came from squinting at truth in bad light. "You're smarter than you pretend to be," Grace said. "Everyone in this house pretends to be something they're not." What do you pretend to be? Isabella considered lying, considered saying something flippant, something that would maintain the distance between them, but the heat made her honest. Or maybe it was just exhaustion from 17 years of performance. Happy, she said. I pretend to be happy. Grace's hand stilled on the watering can. For a moment, something almost like compassion crossed her face. Then it was gone, replaced by that careful neutrality. At least you know you're pretending. That's more than most people manage. They fell into an accidental rhythm after that. Not friendship. That would have required acknowledgement, choice. This was something quieter. Grace would work. Isabella would appear. Sometimes they'd talk. Usually they wouldn't. But the silence between them felt different from the silence everywhere else in the house. It felt like possibility. Isabella learned things in those stolen moments. Grace had a daughter, younger than Isabella, living with Grace's mother in Brooklyn, while Grace lived in the staff quarters and sent money home every month. Why don't you bring her here? Isabella asked once. Grace laughed, short, sharp, nothing like joy. Your father doesn't allow it. Staff stays separate. No complications. That's cruel. That's business. Grace moved to the next window, cloth in hand. Your father doesn't deal in cruelty. That would require feeling something. He deals in efficiency. Isabella wanted to defend him, wanted to explain that he wasn't a monster, just a man doing what men in his position did. But she'd seen enough by 17 to know that explanation wasn't the same as excuse. Do you hate him? She asked instead. Grace stopped cleaning, turned, looked at Isabella with an expression that was almost pity. Hate takes energy. I don't have energy to waste on your father. What about me? The question came out smaller than Isabella intended, vulnerable, real. Grace studied her for a long moment, then, carefully, You're not your father. Not yet. Not yet. The words hung between them like a diagnosis, like Grace could see the future Isabella was trying not to become. The household staff noticed, of course. People in houses like this always notice cracks before the owners do. Mrs. Chen mentioned it to Isabella's mother over morning coffee, voice pitched carefully neutral. Miss Isabella seems quite interested in the third-floor cleaning schedule. Catherine Castellano barely looked up from her iPad. Isabella is bored. Summer does that to young girls. Of course, ma'am. But Mrs. Chen watched, and she wasn't the only one. Marco, her father's driver, saw Isabella and Grace talking in the garden one morning. He said nothing, but his eyes went flat the way they did before he delivered messages her father called corrections. Rosa, the cook, found them in the kitchen late one night. Isabella asking questions about Grace's daughter. Grace answering with the kind of honesty that comes from being too tired to maintain walls. None of them said anything to Vincent Castellano. Not yet. But the silence felt provisional, temporary. Like clouds gathering before a storm that everyone could smell, but no one wanted to name. Isabella's mother threw a dinner party in late July. 50 people, all of them powerful, all of them pretending they didn't know exactly how Vincent Castellano had earned his seat at their table. Isabella wore the dress her mother had chosen, black silk that cost more than Grace earned in 3 months. She sat between a senator's son and a judge's nephew, smiling at their jokes about yachts and summer homes, nodding at their stories about colleges she'd probably never attend because her father preferred to keep his assets close. Grace worked that night, moving between the kitchen and dining room, invisible in her uniform, refilling water glasses that cost more than her monthly rent. Their eyes met once across the table, just once. Isabella saw something in Grace's face she'd never seen before. Not pity, not contempt, something harder to name. Sadness, maybe, or recognition. The look you give someone when you realize they're trapped in the same cage you are, just with prettier bars. The senator's son said something. Isabella laughed on cue. Grace moved on, but something had shifted again. Deeper this time. More dangerous. After the guests left, after her mother had disappeared into her suite with her pills and her carefully maintained exhaustion, Isabella found Grace in the kitchen cleaning crystal that could buy a car. Why do you stay? Isabella asked. Grace didn't look up. Why do you? It's different. This is my family. Is it? Isabella wanted to argue, wanted to explain that blood meant something, that loyalty wasn't a choice but an obligation. But Grace's hands on the crystal were so steady, so certain, and Isabella's own hands were shaking. My daughter needs new shoes, Grace said quietly. Braces next year. College after that, if I can manage it. Your father pays well. Better than anywhere else I could work with my resume. So, you sell your dignity for shoes and braces. Grace set down the crystal, turned, looked at Isabella with eyes that had seen too much to be cruel, but too little to be kind. Everyone sells something, Isabella. The only question is whether you choose the price or someone chooses it for you. It sounded like something her father would say. That's what made it true. Isabella left the kitchen, climbed the stairs to her wing, lay in her expensive bed, in her expensive room, in her expensive life, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. She was starting to understand something that scared her. Grace wasn't the one trapped here. Grace could leave. Grace could walk out those gates anytime she wanted, find another job, another life. Isabella was the one in the cage, and everyone knew it but her. The heat broke in early August with a thunderstorm that shook the windows and made the chandelier in the foyer sway like a hanged man. Isabella watched from her window as lightning turned the grounds into negative film. White trees against black sky, the world inverted. Grace appeared in her doorway, not knocking, just there. You all right? Isabella realized she was crying. When had that started? I don't know how to leave, she said. Grace crossed to the window, stood beside her. Outside, rain turned the manicured gardens into something wild. Nobody does, Grace said. Not at first. You just start walking and hope you're heading toward a door instead of a deeper room. What if there is no door? There's always a door. The question is whether you're willing to pay what it costs to open it. They stood there in the dark, watching the storm. Two women in a house built on violence, trying to imagine what freedom might smell like. People don't change, Isabella's father always said. They just run out of room to pretend. Isabella was running out of room, and the house was starting to notice. AST3, The Descent, 24-36 in Sparia. August turned brutal, the kind of heat that made tempers short and secrets harder to keep. The air conditioning in the East Wing failed again, permanently this time, and the repair crew found rats in the walls. Even money couldn't keep everything beautiful forever. Isabella's mother started spending more time in the city. Charity work, she called it, though everyone knew Catherine Castellano's only charity was toward herself. She'd stay gone for days, returning with shopping bags and a smile that looked rehearsed in hotel mirrors. Her father noticed but said nothing. Vincent Castellano didn't waste energy on what he couldn't control. He simply waited for things to break in ways he could use. Isabella spent more time with Grace, not carefully now, not pretending it was accident. She'd stopped caring who saw, which was its own kind of freedom, the dangerous kind. They'd talk in the garden while Grace deadheaded roses her mother never looked at. In the library while Grace dusted books no one read. In the kitchen late at night when the rest of the staff had gone to bed and only truth moved between them. Grace told her about growing up in Georgia, about her mother teaching her that silence was survival, that invisibility was armor, about coming north looking for something better and finding just a different kind of hard. My daughter asks me sometimes why I work in a house this big when we live in an apartment that small, Grace said one night, hands wrapped around coffee that had gone cold. I tell her I'm building her a bridge. To what? Away from this. Away from cleaning other people's houses and swallowing other people's disrespect. Away from ever having to smile at a man like your father and pretend he's not a monster. Isabella should have defended him, should have said something about family loyalty, about not understanding the complexity of his world. But she'd been watching her father more carefully lately, really watching, the way Grace had taught her to see. She'd seen him take a phone call at dinner and leave the table with a smile that made her stomach turn. She'd seen him hand Marco an envelope that Marco opened with gloves on. She'd seen him look at her mother with the kind of cold assessment you give something that's outlived its usefulness. She was starting to understand that Grace was right. Her father wasn't cruel. Cruel implied passion, emotion. He was simply empty where other people had souls. He's going to notice, Isabella said. Us. He's going to notice and he's going to do something about it. Grace looked at her with those dark eyes that missed nothing. He already knows. Then why hasn't he stopped it? Because he's curious. Grace set down her coffee. Your father didn't get where he is by reacting. He watches. He waits. He lets people hang themselves and then uses the rope for something useful. I won't let him hurt you. Grace almost smiled. Almost. Baby girl, I'm not the one he's worried about. You are. The next morning, Isabella's father called her into his study. The room smelled like leather and cigars and old decisions. Her grandfather's gun collection still hung on the wall, antiques that had killed more men than most modern weapons ever would. Symbols. Everything in Vincent Castellano's world was a symbol. "Sit," he said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. She sat. He took his time, let the silence build pressure. It was a tactic she'd seen him use in negotiations. Let people marinate in their own anxiety until they confessed to crimes they hadn't committed yet. "You've been spending time with the help." Not a question, never questions with her father, just statements that trapped you into confirming what he already knew. "Grace is interesting," Isabella said carefully. "Grace is a maid. Grace is a person." Now he looked up. His eyes were the color of old ice, beautiful, dangerous, capable of freezing you from the inside. "Everyone is a person, Isabella. That's not the point. The point is position, purpose, the role you play in the machinery of how things work." "And what's her role?" "To be invisible. That's what we pay her for, not companionship, not philosophical conversations with my daughter. Invisibility." Isabella felt something sharp lodge in her chest. Anger, maybe, or just the realization that she'd been naive to think this conversation wouldn't come. "I like her," she said simply. "I don't care what you like." He stood, came around the desk, sat on the edge, closer now. Close enough that she could smell the scotch on his breath, even though it was barely noon. "I care what you understand. This house has rules for a reason. Boundaries keep everyone safe." "Safe from what?" "From confusion, from people forgetting their place and making mistakes that hurt everyone." He touched her cheek, a gesture that might have looked paternal to anyone watching. But Isabella felt the threat in it. The promise. "You're young. You think friendship transcends circumstance. But it doesn't. It never does. Grace is here because she needs money. You're here because you're my daughter. Those are facts. Everything else is fantasy." "Maybe I'm tired of facts." His hand dropped. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, recalculated. "Then, you're going to learn a hard lesson." He returned to his desk, picked up his phone. "Marco will be driving you to your aunt's house in Connecticut tomorrow. You'll spend the rest of the summer there." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. Definitive. Final. Her father looked at her with something almost like interest. "No, I'm not leaving." "You're 17, Isabella. You go where I tell you to go." "Then tell me why you're really sending me away. It's not about Grace. You don't care who I talk to. You care that I'm starting to see what you are." Silence. Heavy as guilt, thick as blood. Then her father smiled. The smile that had ended careers and marriages and lives. "You're more like me than I thought," he said quietly. "That's going to be a problem for both of us." Isabella left the study. Her hands were shaking, but her spine was steel. She found Grace in the third-floor hallway, folding linens with the same steady rhythm she brought to everything. "He's sending me away," Isabella said. Grace's hands paused, just for a second, then continued folding. "When?" "Tomorrow." "Then you should pack." "I'm not going." "Yes, you are." Grace set down the linens, turned. Her face was calm, but her eyes were urgent. "You're going because if you don't, he'll find another way to make his point, and his other ways usually involve people getting hurt." "I don't care, but I do." Grace stepped closer, close enough that Isabella could see the silver cross rising and falling with her breath. "You think this is about us being friends? It's not. It's about your father reminding you who has power and who doesn't. You stay, you fight, you prove that you care about me. And he uses that. He'll fire me, or worse. He'll keep me here and make sure I understand every day that my presence makes your life harder. That's how men like him operate. They don't destroy what you love. They corrupt it, poison it, make you wish you'd never cared in the first place." Isabella felt tears burning, but refused to let them fall. "So I just leave? Pretend this didn't matter?" "No. You leave and you remember. You remember what it felt like to see past the marble and the money. You remember that people like me exist, that we're not invisible, just treated like we are. And maybe someday when you're not 17 and trapped in your father's house, you do something about it." That's not enough. It's all there is. Grace picked up the linens again. Back to work. Back to invisible. Go pack. Be smart. Survive him long enough to become someone he can't control. Isabella wanted to argue, wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that she deserved more, that Grace deserved more. But fairness was another fantasy, wasn't it? Another lie the powerful told to keep the powerless hoping. She turned to leave, stopped at the doorway. I won't forget, she said. I know. Grace didn't look up. That's what scares me. That night, Isabella packed, not because her father had ordered it, not because Grace had asked, but because something in her had shifted so fundamentally that staying felt like surrender. She packed slowly, carefully, each item a decision, each choice a small rebellion against the life being written for her. Downstairs, her father was on the phone. She could hear his voice through the floor, calm, controlled, explaining to someone that problems could be solved if you were willing to pay the right price. In the staff quarters, Grace was probably sleeping, or maybe lying awake, wondering if she'd done the right thing by sending Isabella away. In the city, Isabella's mother was probably at some hotel bar, laughing too loud with men who saw her as a conquest, not a person. And Isabella was here, caught between what she was and what she might become. She told herself it was love, this thing she felt for Grace, this desperate need to protect someone who'd shown her more humanity in 2 months than her parents had in 17 years. But love doesn't make you feel this small. This was something else, something raw. The painful recognition that the world was built on foundations she'd been taught not to question, and questioning them meant losing everything she'd ever known. She packed her last dress, closed the suitcase, sat on the bed in the dark. By dawn, she'd be gone, sent away like a problem being solved, a complication being managed. But Grace was right about one thing. She'd remember. She'd remember that, in this house of marble and lies, the only person who'd ever been honest with her was a woman her father paid to be invisible. And that truth felt like swallowing glass, sharp, necessary, unforgiving. Act 4, The Reckoning, 3650 Bissaria. Connecticut in late August felt like exile dressed as vacation. Her aunt's house was smaller than the estate, but still obscene. All white walls and modern art and windows that looked out at nothing but other people's money. Isabella spent her days pretending to read by the pool, nights pretending to sleep in rooms that smelled like lavender and disappointment. Her aunt tried to engage her in conversation about college, about boys, about the future Catherine and Vincent had planned for their daughter, like an investment portfolio. But Isabella had stopped pretending. She answered in monosyllables, smiled when required, counted days like a prisoner marking walls. She called home once. The housekeeper answered. Grace, she was told, was no longer with the family. No explanation, no forwarding information, just gone, clean as surgery. Isabella hung up. Didn't cry. Crying was what her mother did, performative, strategic, ultimately pointless. Instead, she got angry. Real anger, not the teenage tantrum kind. The cold, patient fury that her father had taught her by example. The kind that waits, plans, strikes when the target thinks they're safe. She spent 3 weeks in Connecticut learning to hate carefully. Then she called her father. I want to come home, she said. Have you learned your lesson? His voice was silk over steel. Yes. The lie tasted like power. Good. Marco will pick you up tomorrow. She arrived at the estate on a Thursday. The gates opened like always. The house gleamed like always. Her mother was in the city, her father in his study. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Except Grace was gone, and Isabella was different. She spent the first week being perfect. Obedient daughter, dutiful princess. She attended her mother's charity luncheons, smiled at her father's business associates, asked intelligent questions about the family investments. Vincent Castellano watched his daughter with the satisfaction of a man who'd won a negotiation. His problem had been solved. His daughter had been reminded of her place. Order was restored. He didn't notice that Isabella had started watching him back, really watching. The way Grace had taught her. She noticed when Marco delivered the envelopes wearing gloves. Noticed when her father took certain calls in Italian, the language he used when words needed to stay off official records. Noticed the pattern of men arriving at odd hours, leaving with instructions they never wrote down. She noticed everything, remembered everything, waited. It was Mrs. Chen who gave her the first real piece. The housekeeper had never liked Isabella's father. You could see it in the way she moved around him, careful as someone navigating a room full of traps. "Your friend," Mrs. Chen said, one morning, while Isabella pretended to be interested in the flower arrangements. "She found work in the city, Brooklyn, if you were wondering." Isabella kept her face neutral. "Thank you." Mrs. Chen nodded once. "She asked me to tell you something before she left. Said to remind you that bridges cost money, but freedom costs everything." It took Isabella 2 weeks to find Grace. She waited until her father was in the city on business, told her mother she was going to the library, and took the train to Brooklyn like she was diving off a cliff. Grace lived in a 5th-floor walk-up in Flatbush, the kind of building where the elevator was broken, and the hallway smelled like cooking grease and old dreams. Isabella stood outside the door for 5 full minutes before knocking. Grace answered, looked at her, sighed like she'd been expecting this. "You shouldn't be here. I know. Your father has people everywhere. I know that too." Grace stepped back, let her in. The apartment was small, clean but worn, with furniture that had been nice once, maybe decades ago. School photos on the walls. Grace's daughter, Isabella realized. Pretty girl, with her mother's eyes and a smile that looked fearless. "She's at school," Grace said, following Isabella's gaze. "Smart kid, going to make something of herself." "Like you did? Better than I did." Grace moved to the kitchen, not really a separate room, just a corner with a stove and a dream of counter space. "You want coffee?" "I want to know why you left without saying goodbye." Grace poured coffee into mismatched mugs, handed one to Isabella. Their fingers touched briefly. Grace pulled back like touching fire. "Your father gave me a choice," she said. "Leave quietly with a reference that would help me find work, or stay and watch him destroy my daughter's scholarship to the school she'd worked her whole life to attend. Make sure I understood that my presence in his house was a liability he could monetize, if necessary." Isabella felt something cold settle in her stomach. "He threatened your daughter." "He doesn't threaten. He just explains reality until you understand your options." Grace sat at the small table, looked at Isabella with those eyes that had seen too much. "So I left. Took the reference. Found work with a family in Park Slope who pay less but don't make me feel like I'm selling my soul for grocery money." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. This isn't your fault. This is just how the world works when you're born without the right kind of protection." Isabella sat across from her. The table was small enough that their knees almost touched. "I'm going to stop him." Grace laughed. Actually laughed, though it sounded like breaking glass. "Stop him from what? Being a criminal? Baby girl, half of New York knows what your father does. The other half pretends they don't because it's convenient. You think one teenage girl with a conscience is going to change that? I have access, information, I've been watching, I know things. Things that would get you killed if you tried to use them. Things that would protect me if I used them right." Grace went very still, set down her coffee, studied Isabella like she was seeing her for the first time. "You're serious? He took you away from me, threatened your daughter because I dared to see you as human. That's not power, that's fear, and I'm done being afraid of him." "Isabella, my grandmother left me money, a trust fund my father can't touch. It's not active until I'm 18, but that's only 8 months away. I can hire lawyers, real ones, the kind who don't work for my father. You're talking about destroying your own family. I'm talking about stopping a man who ruins lives for profit." Isabella leaned forward. "You taught me to see, Grace. You showed me what this house really is. I can't unsee that. And I can't go back to pretending everyone in service is invisible just because my father pays them to disappear." Grace looked at her for a long time, then quietly, "You know what this will cost you? Your mother will never forgive you. Your father will. My father will do what he always does. He'll try to control it, manage it, turn it into something he can use." Isabella's hands were steady now, certain. "But I have something he doesn't." "What's that?" "Nothing left to lose." It wasn't true, not entirely. She'd lose the house, the money, the last pretense that her family was anything but a beautiful lie. But those were things, not truths, and she was tired of trading truth for comfort. Grace stood, walked to the window. Outside, Brooklyn moved at street level. Real life, messy and loud and honest in ways the estate never was. "If you do this," Grace said without turning, "you can't undo it. You understand that? There's no going back to being Daddy's little girl once you burn that bridge." "Good. I never liked that bridge anyway." Grace turned, and for the first time since Isabella had met her, she smiled. Really smiled. Not the careful, neutral expression she wore like armor. An actual smile that reached her eyes and made her look younger, lighter, free. "You're going to be all right," she said. "Not now, maybe not for a long time, but eventually." Isabella stood, crossed to where Grace stood by the window. They looked out together at the city spread below them like possibility. "Will you help me?" Isabella asked. "Help you destroy your father? Help me build something better on the rubble." Grace considered this. Then, carefully, "What do you need?" Isabella told her. Names, dates, patterns she'd noticed, the men in gloves, the phone calls in Italian, the way money moved through her father's world, like blood through a body. Necessary, invisible, leaving traces everywhere for people who knew how to look. Grace listened, asked questions, made notes on a pad that had seen better days. When Isabella finished, Grace sat back, let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for years. "You're your father's daughter," she said, just aimed in a different direction. "Is that a compliment?" "It's a warning. You use his tools, you risk becoming him." "Then I'll be careful." "Careful people don't start wars with monsters." "No," Isabella agreed. "But sometimes the monsters start wars with us. We just decide whether to fight back or stay on our knees." Grace looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Decision made. "All right. I know some people, journalists who've been trying to touch your father for years, but never had enough to make it stick. Prosecutors who can't get witnesses because everyone's too scared to talk." She stood. "You give them what they need, I'll make sure it gets to the right hands. And if my father finds out, then we both better be somewhere he can't reach." They stood there in that small Brooklyn apartment, making plans that would either free them both or destroy everything they'd ever known. It wasn't vengeance they were building, not quite. It was gravity, the kind that pulls everything down eventually, no matter how high you build your towers or how thick you make your walls. Her father had taught her that everything falls. He just never thought she'd be the one to push. He never saw it coming, not because it was sudden, but because it was patient. And Isabella had learned patience from the best predator she knew. ACT-5, the Echo, 50s or 60s origers. The investigation broke like dawn, slow, then all at once. The first article ran in October, just before Isabella's 18th birthday. A New York Times expose detailing labor violations at the waterfront. Illegal union practices, missing pension funds. Nothing that directly touched Vincent Castellano, but close enough that his lawyers started making calls. The second article came 2 weeks later. This one had teeth, names, dates, photographs of men in gloves delivering envelopes, a former associate willing to testify in exchange for immunity, walls beginning to crack. Her father called her into his study on a Sunday morning. The room smelled different now, like desperation pretending to be scotch. "You've been talking," he said. Not a question. Isabella sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair she'd sat in as a child, listening to him explain how the world worked, how power was just physics, applied correctly, irresistibly. "I've been learning," she said. "You taught me that information is currency. I just found better ways to spend it." He studied her with those ice chip eyes, looking for weakness, finding none. "You have no idea what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done. I've given prosecutors enough to start looking where they should have been looking for years. The rest writes itself. You'll lose everything. Everything I had was already rotten. I'm just letting it fall." He stood, came around the desk. Closer now, the way he'd always moved when he needed to intimidate. But Isabella didn't flinch. Didn't look away. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "The kind that can't be fixed." "No, you made the mistake. You thought because I was young, I was stupid. Because I was your daughter, I was yours to control." She stood to meet him eye to eye. "But I'm not your daughter anymore. I'm the person who remembers Grace's hands on expensive crystal, working for money you earned destroying people. I'm the person who knows that love isn't control, and power isn't the same as worth." For the first time in her life, Isabella saw her father without the performance, without the mask. Just a man, getting old, realizing too late that the daughter he'd raised to inherit his kingdom had instead chosen to burn it down. "Grace Williams was a maid," he said, voice hoarse. "You're destroying your family over a maid. Grace was a person. That's what you never understood. That's why you lost." She left his study, walked through the house one last time. The marble floors that had never known warmth. The crystal chandeliers that caught light but never held it. The expensive emptiness of a life built on other people's suffering. Her mother was in the solarium, among the orchids she'd never named. Catherine looked up as Isabella passed, eyes red from crying, or pills, or the slow realization that the beautiful life she'd maintained was collapsing. "Where will you go?" her mother asked. Isabella paused at the doorway. "Somewhere honest. There's no such place. Then I'll build one." She moved into Grace's apartment in late November. The trust fund had activated, providing enough money to pay rent and fund what came next. Grace's daughter Maya had accepted her scholarship, safe now, beyond her father's reach. The legal proceedings took months. Grand juries, depositions, testimony that unspooled decades of carefully hidden violence. Isabella sat through it all, answering questions with the same steady calm Grace had shown folding linens. Her father's empire dissolved slowly. Some associates flipped, others went to prison. Vincent Castellano himself was indicted on 17 counts ranging from racketeering to murder conspiracy. Isabella attended the first day of his trial, sat in the gallery where he could see her. Their eyes met once. She thought he might look angry. Instead, he looked almost proud, as if even in defeat he saw his own reflection. The estate was seized. Her mother moved to Florida, to a condo purchased with money that couldn't be traced back to crimes. They didn't speak anymore. That was fine. Some silences are earned. Isabella got a job. Real work, the kind that made her hands tired and her back ache. She waitressed at a diner in Park Slope, saved money, started taking classes at community college. Grace helped her study at the kitchen table that was still too small, but felt exactly right. "You could have kept some of the money," Grace said one night, watching Isabella struggle through economics homework. "Used your grandmother's trust for something easier than this." "Easy isn't the point." "What is?" Isabella looked up. Outside the window, Brooklyn hummed with life. Real, messy, honest. Nothing like the estate. Nothing like the world she'd been born to inherit. "Building a bridge," she said. "Like you did. One that leads away from who I could have become." Grace smiled. "Your father was right about one thing. You were smart. He was right about other things, too. Power is physics. Information is currency. Everything falls eventually." "Sounds like you learned his lessons well." "No." Isabella closed her textbook. "I learned his methods, but I'm using them for something he could never understand." "What's that?" "Freedom." They sat in comfortable silence. The apartment was warm despite the late autumn chill. Maya was at her desk in the corner, working on college applications. The radio played old Motown, and somewhere down the hall, someone was cooking something that smelled like cinnamon and possibility. This was Isabella's life now. Small, simple, true. Nothing like the marble and crystal. Nothing like the gates and the gardens and the carefully maintained lie of belonging to power. But it was hers, built on choices she'd made, not circumstances she'd inherited. Her father's trial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict came on a Tuesday in late spring, guilty on 12 counts, 40 years minimum. Isabella didn't attend the sentencing. She was at work, refilling coffee, smiling at regulars who knew her as Bella, the college kid saving for something better, not the girl who'd destroyed a dynasty. Grace called with the news. Isabella listened, said thank you, hung up. Then she went back to work, because life was about moving forward, not backward, about building, not destroying, about choosing who you wanted to be instead of accepting who you were born as. That night, she stood on the fire escape outside Grace's apartment. The city spread out below her like a promise, imperfect, loud, real. Nothing like the view from the estate, where everything had been manicured and controlled and ultimately empty. Grace joined her, handed her coffee in a mug that had a chip in the rim. "You all right?" Grace asked. "I think so." Isabella sipped coffee that was too hot and somehow perfect. "It's strange. I thought I'd feel different. Triumphant maybe, or sad." "What do you feel?" Isabella considered this. The city hummed below them. Sirens wailed, someone laughed, a dog barked, all of it messy and alive and indifferent to who her father had been, or what she'd done to stop him. "Free," she said finally. "I feel free." Grace put her arm around Isabella's shoulders. They stood there as the sun set over Brooklyn, painting the sky in colors that had no names in her father's world. By dawn, the news would move on. Her father would become a number in a system he'd spent his life corrupting. Her mother would find new ways to pretend the past had never happened. The estate would be sold, probably to someone just like Vincent Castellano, another man who believed power was the same as worth. But Isabella would still be here, in this small apartment with this woman who taught her to see, building a life one shift at a time, one class, one choice, one moment of refusing to become what she'd been raised to be. She didn't want revenge. That had never been the point. She wanted peace. Revenge just got her there faster. Grace squeezed her shoulder once, then headed back inside, leaving Isabella alone with the city and the gathering dark. The air smelled like rain and possibility, like something ending quietly and something else beginning without fanfare or announcement. Isabella stood on the fire escape for a long time, watching the city forget. Watching lights turn on in windows where people lived, lives her father had never touched, where Grace's hands had never had to clean things she couldn't afford, where girls like Maya could dream without wondering what it would cost. She thought about Grace's words that first night in the kitchen. Everyone sells something. The only question is whether you choose the price or someone chooses it for you. She'd chosen, and the price had been everything she'd ever known. But what she'd bought with that price was worth it. A life, her own, honest, small, true. By the time she went inside, the rain had started, soft, persistent, washing the city clean the way it did every night, preparing for tomorrow's version of itself. Isabella closed the window, locked it, turned back to the warm apartment where Grace was making tea, and Maya was laughing at something on her phone, and the radio was playing songs about love and loss and the stubborn human refusal to give up. She was 18, broke, alone in every way that mattered, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was. Not Isabella Castellano, daughter of a criminal empire, just Bella, the girl who'd learned to see, who'd chosen truth over comfort, who'd walked away from marble and crystal and found something more valuable in a fifth-floor walk-up with chipped mugs and honest company. The city forgot her father by morning, but she didn't. That's how survival sounds. Quiet. That's how freedom feels, like swallowing glass until you're strong enough to digest truth without bleeding. And that's how grace saves you, not by making you perfect, but by showing you that being real is harder and better than being right. She poured herself tea, sat at the small table, started tomorrow's homework while around her. Life continued in all its messy, beautiful, ordinary glory. And somewhere in a federal prison, her father was learning what she already knew. The truth doesn't break people. The pretending does.